very excited. Let's welcome Gillian.
Thank you, Ed. I want to say thank you to Ed so much for having me here, for inviting me to give this keynote address. It was an interesting challenge to write a speech. I can babble on like all day about how to use parenthetical citations, but to have to write a coherent speech about poetry was a good exercise for me. So, and I should say that I did leave one page of my speech at home, and my husband and daughter had rushed over here, drove past the church, handed my page out the window, and I ran back in. So we have the whole thing here now. I'm going to start by reading part of the poem that was read at President Obama's inauguration, called One Today. One sun rose on us today, kindled over our shores, peeking over the Smokies, greeting the faces of the Great Lakes, spreading a simple truth across the Great Plains, then charging across the Rockies. One light, waking up rooftops, under each one a story told by our silent gestures, moving behind windows. My face, your face, millions of faces in morning's mirrors, each one yawning to life, crescendoing into our day. Pencil yellow school buses, the rhythm of traffic lights, fruit stands, apples, limes, and oranges arrayed like rainbows begging our praise. Silver trucks heavy with oil or paper, bricks or milk, teeming over highways alongside us on our way to clean tables, read ledgers or save lives, to teach geometry or ring up groceries, as my mother did for 20 years so I could write this poem. Thank you. I'm going to read a whole bunch of poems, most of them by other people, and just so you know, you don't have to clap after them, that's okay. So in the past few weeks, poetry really has been in the national spotlight. When President Obama's inauguration, Richard Blanco read his poem One Today, I think the public was reminded that one, poetry exists at all, and that two, it exists in a public arena for a public purpose. And in the 20th and 21st century, I think poetry has become more and more a private art. But when poetry first passed from mouth to ear, before written language existed, poetry was a public event. The adventures, the elegies, the celebrations were presented in verse for all to hear and share. Usually, I think America forgets this. After all, the big poetry epics, the great poetic statements, aren't really part of our American culture. Nonetheless, when there is a great public celebration or an unfathomable public grief, it is to poetry that people turn. It is poetry that helps express the emotions that seem too much for any one individual to carry, and it is the poets who step up and help to shoulder that burden. In 1962, when John F. Kennedy was inaugurated, he asked the great Robert Frost to read the gift outright, even going so far as to ask for a change in the last line of the poem to make it more hopeful. Frost was an avid Kennedy supporter from way before Kennedy even declared his candidacy, so he made the change, and he came to Washington, the first poet to ever be included in such a government event. Things didn't work out quite as planned, though. First, Frost did something he didn't expect to do. He wrote a brand new poem for the inauguration, and he planned to read that. Second, it was so bright and glaring out that he couldn't read his brand new poem, so that went out. And he ended up reciting, because he was great and because he was Robert Frost, he could recite the gift outright from memory. Here's his poem, The Gift Outright. And I can never get Frost's voice out of my head, so my own voice sounds completely wrong in this poem, but I'll do my best. The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia, but we were England's, still colonials, possessing what we still were unpossessed by, possessed by what we now no more possessed. Something we were withholding made us weak until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war. To the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she would become. So this resonated with the American people in a way that a piece of fiction or a dramatic monologue just could not do, because poetry is emotion distilled into its purest form, and no other literature, no other art could fit that moment and carry its expectations and the hopes of the people where they needed to go. For me, Richard Blanco's poem, well, of course, still not bearing the iconic weight of frost, also did this. It wasn't a perfect poem. It may have been a little strained, a bit preachy, too political for some, but there are as many critiques as there are people who actually listened to the poem all the way through that day. In fact, I think there are probably many more. But for me, the sweep of Blanco's poem, the mix of the current and the historical events with the personal, the sweep from that wide open landscape to the tiniest detail, the inclusion of landscapes from Appalachia to the Sierras did exactly what it was supposed to do. It celebrated a particular moment, and in that moment, public as it was, his poem included us all. I'm going to read a little bit more of it. One ground, our ground, rooting us to every stalk of corn, every head of wheat sown by sweat and hands, hands gleaning coal or planting windmills in deserts and hilltops that keep us warm, hands digging trenches, routing pipes and cables, hands as worn as my father's cutting sugarcane so my brother and I could have books and shoes. The dust of farms and deserts, cities and plains mingled by one wind, our breath, breathe. Hear it through the day's gorgeous din of honking cabs, buses launching down avenues, the symphony of footsteps, guitars, and screeching subways, the unexpected songbird on your clothesline. Again, only poetry with its figurative language and its sounds and its force of image and maybe even a hint of the gravity that our old English teachers told us poetry had to have. Let us ride with that poem and its expansiveness and really see ourselves in it. Another celebratory poem, I'm going off script a tiny bit. Another celebratory poem was the StarSpangled Banner, which was written in 1814 by Francis Scott Key, as you know, is originally a poem called Defense of Fort McHenry. And he watched the battle happening, the rockets' red glare and all that kind of thing. And he wrote a 4-stanza poem. Luckily, they only make us sing the first stanza. But that was a poem that began to celebrate America's newness. And it was written to be shared, and very quickly was shared with the wider community, not just poets, not just Francis Scott Key's family, but in fact the wider community who were beginning to see themselves as Americans rather than, as Frost talked about, as colonials. So sometimes poetry helps us celebrate, but perhaps more often poetry consoles. When a tragedy occurs on a national scale, when the emotions of the moment overwhelm us and threaten to drown us, it is to poetry that we turn for comfort, and also, perhaps even more importantly, to express what we fear we might not be able to express adequately ourselves. In April of 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and Walt Whitman, in his grief, a grief that so much of America shared, wrote the really amazing, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." I was no fan of Ronald Reagan's at that time, but I thought his speech, even as a high school student, his speech was so comforting and I reread it last night again, and really it's an amazing speech. But he quoted from a Petrarchan sonnet called High Flight by John Gillespie Magee Jr. And it's a beautiful sonnet, but Ronald Reagan did an interesting thing. He took the first line and he took the last line of the sonnet, and he used them to comfort us as people who were in mourning for this awful thing. And he used the phrases, "I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and touched the face of God." And I think, again, people turn to poetry in order to find comfort and find solace, because again, even the most skilled speechwriters cannot necessarily come up with language that is as pure and as distilled as sometimes we need it to be. In September of 2001, Billy Collins, who's come up several times today, was the US Poet Laureate, and in response to the awful events of 9/11, he wrote an elegy called The Names. It's comprised largely of the names of victims of that day in alphabetical order, and the poem gave rise to a national grief and acknowledged the losses, those losses that we all really experience with dignity and with honor. I should say that, of course, there are not all the names, but representative names. And I'm going to read just part of this. The names. Yesterday, I lay awake in the palm of the night. A soft rain stole in, unhelped by any breeze. And when I saw the silver glaze on the windows, I started with A, Ackerman, as it happened, then Baxter and Calabro, Davis and Eberling, names falling into place as droplets fell through the dark, names printed on the ceiling of the night, names slipping around a watery bend. 26 willows on the banks of a stream. In the morning, I walked out barefoot among thousands of flowers heavy with dew like the eyes of tears, and each had a name. Fiore, inscribed on a yellow petal, then Gonzalez and Hahn, Ishikawa and Jenkins, names written in the air and stitched into the cloth of the day, a name under a photograph taped to a mailbox, monogram on a torn shirt. I see you spelled out on storefront windows and on the bright, unfurled awnings of this city. And of course, the poem goes on from there. More recently, after the shootings at Sandy Hook Elementary, a collaborative poem was started by California poet Juan Felipe Herrera. He wrote a poem and he invited other people to add their own poems to this. His poem is called Little Ones, We Carry You. Little ones, we carry you with our hearts today and tomorrow. Many tomorrows, we will be there with you. Whether we have flowers or poems or prayers, with our hands, our bodies somehow, we will touch the earth for you and the rain and the green winds. We will sing for you and your teachers who covered you and your principal who protected you and your mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, all who are one now. We will become them. We will become you somehow. As we grow, we will grow for you and embrace each other. The songs from your sky hearts will be the songs from our city hearts. Songs lighting your hands will be the songs lifting our hands. Somehow we contain you. Somehow you are here inside. Go up to the skies, touching the infinite now. Little ones, we carry you with our hearts today and tomorrow. This is our song. We will end the fire. Let us sing together. It was interesting to read this poem and then the poems that accompanied it. Many of the comments that accompanied it were not actually poems, but you could tell that the people writing and commenting on this poem and on the events themselves were finding comfort here. Again, poetry helps to poetry is essential to our lives, and dare I say, because I know here that I'm preaching to the choir, they're essential to the lives of people who don't actively read and write poetry or just don't admit it. And in that moment of joy, in the crush of crisis, again and again, it is to poetry that people look, because poetry can do the work of clarifying our feelings for ourselves and of building connections, and it's connections that are key, of building those connections between us, members of such a wide and such a varied society. I've spent a lot of time talking about public poetry because it's something I've spent a lot of time in the last few months thinking about. As Poet Laureate of Modesto, suddenly there were a lot of questions to consider. How does one write a poem to celebrate an event or memorialize a friend? Does one start with the details? Is it the big picture that matters? And what about the demographic? Will the poem fit their needs? Will it offend, or worse, will it pander? Ugh. I can only imagine Richard Blanco's concerns as he wrote a poem that would be heard and read and definitely critiqued by an entire nation. I've written a couple of poems now as Modesto Poet Laureate, and it's an interesting exercise to keep my own poetic wits about me while writing for an audience of people who, poetry is not something they think about every single day. And so I know you, Debbie, and I know you, Ed, know what I'm talking about here. It is an interesting challenge, and Allegra as well. So how do we honor the listeners? How do we honor the occasion? And how do we stay true to ourselves as poets? So when the Modesto Arch was rededicated in October, I was asked to write a poem to help celebrate the event. And I got to read it at a Chamber of Commerce event the afternoon of the dedication. But I found myself turning to history to help create the momentum of the poem, and I tried to write a poem that incorporated Modesto's past as well as kind of caught the contagion of that moment's sense of hope and its commitment to the future. So I started with a quote from the original architect's assistant. His name was Clarence Dakin. And he said in 1911, and he wrote along with the plans for the arch and sent a little note in that said, "We purposely made the arch elaborate. We believed that Modesto should have something that any city might be proud of. Paris itself would not sneer at such an arch as this." And the poem. But we don't care what Paris thinks. This arch is made for nowhere else on earth but here, our town, with its constant shifts of commerce and traffic and people, with its canals and shopping centers and taquerias, with its fortunes and misfortunes, with the here, today, gone tomorrow buildings, with the million stories buried beneath the roots of our trees or carried on the wind over and under, and through this elaborate arch, past the words that shine out over the neat grids of streets, over the downtown rooftops. Because in this new place, in a new century, anything was possible. And the city fathers and mothers felt this and wanted everyone, the men in their boaters, the women in their white skirts, to feel this too. Our faces, unimagined in 1912, our lives simply blank pages, years ahead, but a part of the gleaming future, and they knew that whoever would live here, whenever they live here, would think it out, would make plans, would lay the deep foundations for better lives, for new lives, and so those optimists spelled it out in lights. Here in our modest town, they hoped we'd have it all someday, and it doesn't matter if we're not there yet, because after all, nobody gets Modesto's goat. We know who we are, and we know what to do. We'll keep working hard, moving forward, making our way, and 100 years from now, on the unimagined faces of the future people of Modesto, this optimism, elaborate and spelled out in lights, will continue to shine. Oh, thank you. Thanks. So after the inauguration, in response to Blanco's poem, columnist Alexandra Petri wrote an article called "Is Poetry Dead?" She's a Washington Post columnist. Is poetry dead? Well, she got a lot of heat for that, all from poets. So obviously we can answer that question for ourselves right here and now. Of course poetry is not dead. It's alive in the festivals we attend, in the collections we buy, in the readings, in the poems we send out, and the poems we keep in the back of drawers. I've got a lot of those. In fact, even if there were not the festivals and lit mags and books or readings, poetry would be alive and well because we write poetry and people need poetry. Poetry is not dead because the poems we write work for us. That's the smallest level, that the poem works for its poet, but maybe the most important level. And of course, poetry isn't dead because it's alive in us and we are alive and kicking. As were the poets who read Petri's column and came at her alive and kicking and quite angry. She ended up writing a second column in which she tried to take back her questions about the effectiveness and power of poetry. She wrote about the dangers of criticizing an entire community of people who, you know, we play with words and we know how to use them. So she wrote, if they are wordsmiths, they will send you a lot of messages, often peppered with beautiful quotations. And if you are as susceptible as I am to beautiful quotations, you will crawl off into a hole somewhere and wonder if Wallace Stevens would really be as disappointed in you as they are making out. So, the poets have spoken, written, and been heard. So I've digressed a little bit, though. Petrie did ask a more interesting question in her original article. She asked if poetry still had the power to change anything. I would say yes. Poetry has the power to change lives, but perhaps this power has changed over the years. I think about Anna Akhmatova, a Russian poet holding court in her freezing apartment in St. Petersburg during Stalin's reign, having had her poetry banished from publication for years at a time. And I think about how she wrote anyway, and she shared her poetry anyway at great personal risk. And I think how much her poetry meant to the people around her. You know, they went to her and they found her poetry and they shared it at risk of going to jail themselves. And her poetry gave them hope, it gave them strength, and they got through that terrible time. Her poetry changed people's perspectives. A poem today need not change the whole world at once, but I do think poems are capable of changing the world in small ways, one person at a time. A high school student reads a Dickinson poem and gets it, and that student's world is changed. One person on a city bus reads one of Forrest Gander's poems about dealing with a difficult child and realizes they are not alone, and their world is changed. One teacher reads a poem her student has written and sees a new mind opening up to the possibilities of poetry, and her world shifts and changes, and on and on and on, a million different ways. So no longer do we spend much time memorizing, reciting poetry, either in our schools or on our own. But poetry still reverberates in all our lives, publicly and privately, in times of grief and in times of joy, and happily for us here during most times in between as well. Poetry continues to change the world, one person and one poem at a time, and so I feel certain, and I hope you will agree, that poetry has a pretty vibrant place in our world, especially here in Modesto, in Stanislaus County. And I think it will continue to have that vibrancy far, far into the future, far beyond us all. Poetry is not going away, not even as much as 8th graders wish it would. The poem Robert Frost wrote especially for Kennedy's inauguration is entitled Dedication, and the final lines read, "A golden age of poetry and power, of which this noonday's the beginning hour." And since poetry can change our lives, and because poetry isn't dead and it's not going anywhere, and because poetry has powerful work to do, we'd better get started again this noonday hour, more or less. And thank you so much. Thank you. And I want to say thank you again to Ed and to Roberta for organizing this event today. It's really great to see you guys here, and to both Carol and Gary for their wonderful presentations this morning. It was excellent to be here. Thank you so much. Okay.